Hello, everyone. Welcome. Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue à la NewOrleans. Welcome, everyone, to the 103rd meeting of the Ecological Society of America. Bienvenido a todos a Nueva Orleans, especialmente a nuestros colegas de la Sociedad Científica Mexicana de Ecología. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our colleagues of the Mexican Scientific Society of Ecology. They're special guests here at our meeting. My name is Catherine O'Riordan. I'm the Executive Director of the Ecological Society of America. I began the position in April, and I'm thrilled to be part of such a vibrant and passionate community. You can just feel it in the air as you arrive here at the Convention Center. It's very exciting. I want to extend a special welcome to our online participants. We are live streaming this event for the public and for scientists around the world who are not able to travel and be with us today. I did a little bit of research before I came, and it turns out this is the third time ESA has met in New Orleans. You can find some records in the ESA bulletin. I learned that the ESA members first gathered here in December 1931 over New Year's Eve to hear about 50 talks on ecology in conjunction with several other societies. I'm sure it was a lot of fun. ESA returned to New Orleans together with AIBS and met at Tulane University in June of 1976. As you can imagine, the city has changed quite a bit since then, since we were last here, markedly impacted by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The theme of this meeting is extreme events, ecosystem resilience, and human well-being, and emphasizes how our civilization is tied to how well the ecosystem can rebound from extreme conditions. New Orleans is a great venue for ESA. We have over 3,300 participants pre-registered, with many participating in field trips, workshops, and all of the exciting sessions. We hope you have the opportunity to discover the sights of the Gulf region. And of course, the city is known for nightlife, and I'm sure many of you will be out there enjoying all that New Orleans has to offer. I want to thank the sponsors for this meeting, and in particular, the Walton Family Foundation, who's made the live streaming and archiving of this session possible. The Walton Family Foundation has made large investments in restoring Louisiana coast as part of its mission to solve environmental problems, especially in this Gulf region. ESA's President, Rich Poyet, who I will more formally introduce to you tomorrow, will be our host and will open the session, in which we will award the ESA Regional Policy Award and hear from our keynote speaker, Robert Twilley, who's the Executive Director of Louisiana Sea Grant and a professor at Louisiana State University. So I invite Rich Poyet to come up and take over the session. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone. And several years ago, when I was in the Public Affairs Committee, I was actually the Vice President for Public Affairs. We came up with the idea for a Regional Policy Award, and it's one of the very special things that we do every time we have our annual meeting. So I'm glad we're still doing it. And I am going to be introducing the introducer to our awardee. Astrid Caldes joins me to present the award. She is a member of our ESA Public Affairs Committee. She's past chair of the ESA Policy Section, also past chair of the Mid-Atlantic chapter, and we thank her for her time and energy that she has given to the Ecological Society of America. Currently, she is a senior climate scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and now she will introduce the ESA 2018 Regional Policy Award winner, Walter Luget.
Thank you very much, Rich. Welcome, everybody. Tonight we're here in New Orleans, a city that was devastated by Hurricane Katrina 13 years ago. The convention center that we are in now was a shelter of last resort, housing 25,000 people who came to await rescue from flood waters. Most of us remember the devastating images beamed across our television screens from that terrible time. The city and its people are still recovering, and Katrina served as the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the country when addressing preparedness and adaptation to extreme events like Hurricane Katrina. Among important lessons is the use of science in every step of the process. We as scientists know that providing the very best science to inform policy may have mixed results, but by golly, we'll keep trying. So that's why every year, ESA's Public Affairs Committee selects a Regional Policy Award winner to recognize an elected or appointed official in the area where the annual meeting is held, in recognition of their use of ecological science when making policy decisions. This year's recipient is the Honorable Walter Leger III, Speaker pro tempore of the Louisiana House of Representatives and the representative for New Orleans District 91. According to Tulane University, as of the turn of the century, 80% of the nation's coastal land loss occurred in Louisiana. The state loses the equivalent of 1 football field of wetlands per hour, although some estimates say now every 15 minutes. Representative Leger has demonstrated a consistent interest in coastal issues, raising awareness about the underlying science of coastal restoration among policymakers through briefings from ecologists and other relevant scientists at an unofficial coastal caucus in Louisiana's House of Representatives. Among other priorities, he has highlighted coastal restoration and preservation. He has worked actively to ensure proper use of funds intended for coastal protection and restoration, including funds stemming from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Representative Leger is also an avid supporter of Louisiana's excellent Coastal Master Plan, which focuses on building and preserving land and reducing flood risk through large-scale projects. It is ESA's honor to present the 2018 Regional Policy Award to Representative Leger.
Thank you so much. It is quite an honor to be with you. I want to thank you for not just the work that you do, but for being here in New Orleans with us for the next week. It was mentioned that Louisiana loses a football field every 60 minutes, and some say every 15 minutes. I wanted to say on the bright side of things, some people say that it's only every 100 minutes now. So maybe we're improving. If we are, it's because of people like you and because of scientists like you and members of the Ecological Society of America, and I want to thank you for that. It is not the most popular time in American political history for science and for the support of science, but I recognize, and I know that many of my colleagues recognize, the hard work that you do to make sure that policymakers, not just in Louisiana but across the country, have the best possible information available to make the best possible choices that are necessary. It was mentioned that 13 years ago in 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the city of New Orleans and South Louisiana, as well as the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, and caused significant damage. I don't think that it takes much to remind anyone in this room, and certainly anyone within earshot of this convention center, of how difficult that time was. But what we've tried to do in the state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans is not just rebuild our city and our state the way that she was before, but to rebuild it in the best possible way that we could, as if we were rebuilding the city in the way that we always dreamed it could be. And so I think as you visit this city over the next several days, you will find that there's been not just massive investment from the taxpayers of the United States of America in helping to rebuild our infrastructure and helping to ensure that navigational channels stay open and helping to make sure that they're properly maintained so that they don't wreak havoc on citizens when the next storm comes. But you will also find that nations around the world have made investment in our recovery, and that private investment from all over the globe has been made in historic restoration projects and other infrastructure investment to make our city stronger. Now, following Hurricane Katrina, the state was ultimately able to implement our coastal master plan, which has been reviewed annually and was renewed in 2017 and called at the time for $50 billion to be invested over 50 years. Of course, that price tag continues to go up as time goes on, and so we continue to work in the legislature and in policymaking circles around the state to find creative ways to not just bring federal, state, and local resources into the Coastal Master Plan, but also to supplement that master plan, to supplement it by investing in sustainable, non-structural flood protection projects and coastal restoration projects through the investment of private dollars. As we partner with major economic drivers in our state, entities that you don't always see partnering to do important projects related to our ecology. Companies like Chevron and other oil and gas companies have brought significant dollars to bear as we try to create innovative ways to ensure that that restoration can be complete. We also, and I think you will take note as you visit, have major challenges along our coast as it relates to our communities. These communities have been commercial fishermen for generations, families that have year in and year out for decades, for hundreds of years, been part of some of the greatest natural fisheries that this country has to offer and help to feed our nation and the world. You will also find a port system that's one of the greatest port systems in the world and that connects with 30 other states through the Mississippi River and its tributaries to ensure that our nation's farmers get their products where they need to go. And so while we continue to focus on the things that are important, we also recognize that there are major, not just statewide or citywide, but national and international implications to the strategic location of the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana. And so I am tremendously honored to receive this recognition, but I'm more honored that you're here to discuss really important concepts related to climate change and related to science that can lead to future policies being developed that not only ensure that we can have economic growth and investment, that we can have strong infrastructure, but that we also learn how to live with water in a smarter way, and that we learn how to build more sustainable communities with the best possible science available to inform policymakers on how to do that. So thank you for being with us in New Orleans and in Louisiana. Enjoy yourself. If anybody gets in any trouble, please let me know. I'll be happy to bail you out. Thank you.
Okay, now for our opening plenary speaker. That was very exciting to hear about how a local politician can utilize science, and thank you for that talk. Our next introducer, we're going to have someone introduce the plenary speaker, Dr. Charles Nylon, who I've known for very many years. Charlie and I were graduate students together at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, so I've known him a long time. And he also works, he's an urban ecologist, and we've worked together on the Baltimore LTER for many years. And he is currently a professor of urban wildlife management at the University of Missouri. And his research focuses on urban wildlife conservation and on the human dimensions of wildlife conservation. Charlie has been awarded ESA's Commitment to Human Diversity in Ecology Award in 2014. He co-founded ESA's Environmental Justice section, and he helped design the SEEDS program. Charlie.
Hi. Good evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Twilley, who's our opening plenary speaker. Our meeting's theme this year is Extreme Events, Ecosystem Resilience, and Human Well-Being. And for the past 15 years, ESA has had an environmental justice section. And one of the goals of that section has been to identify the ecology that's embedded in environmental justice, and also to work with ESA members on understanding how an environmental justice framework might be useful in their approaches to ecology. That framework explicitly involves engaging people impacted by environmental injustices as an active participant in the planning and conducting of research and applying that research to solutions to their problems. We mentioned that the theme of this, the opening theme is extreme events, ecosystem resilience, and human well-being, and New Orleans exemplifies that. As you've already heard, Hurricane Katrina was an extreme event, but New Orleans has been using science to apply solutions to those issues, and that is using the environmental justice framework. Dillard University hosts the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, and Tulane and Xavier University sponsor a project called the New Orleans Urban Rat Study that both seek to use an environmental justice framework to address how to deal with extreme events and ecosystem resilience. So tonight we're honored to have Dr. Robert Twilley to give tonight's plenary. He is a world-class wetlands researcher. For over 35 years, his work is focused on some of the most impressive global wetland ecosystems. Dr. Twilley, Executive Director of the Louisiana Sea Grant and a distinguished professor in the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Science at Louisiana State University, will share about his work on ecosystem restoration efforts around the world, including the Mississippi River Delta, the Chesapeake Bay, the Florida Everglades, and mangroves around the world. Over his career, Dr. Twilley has produced 150 peer-reviewed publications, which have generated thousands of citations. Of note, his work includes the first global carbon budget and the blue carbon value of mangroves. As a defender of wetlands and a leader in wetland science, he has pioneered a variety of research partnerships, collaborations, and outreach projects. Dr. Twilley's presentation tonight will describe an ecosystem design approach to link multiple purpose needs of the diverse services and stakeholders that a large river system and coastal network provides. The combination of systems and design thinking focuses on a three-layered framework integrating ecosystem science, economy, and community, resulting in an ecosystem design plan for a more sustainable coast. If time allows, Robert will take questions directly following his presentation, which is entitled Ecosystem Design Approaches in a Highly Engineered Landscape of the Mississippi River Delta. Bob.
Thanks. Here we go. Good evening. Okay, let's see. I need to calibrate myself here. Welcome to New Orleans. And so we're going to start with a slide. While you're getting the slides up, I also want to thank congratulate Representative Leger. From the science community, I can tell you how important it is to have someone of his caliber that we get to talk to, and the legislators had made some tough decisions, particularly just the developing of CPRA and the development of the master plan, which in 2017, and I'm going to show you some slides tonight, really had a tough message, and it was a tough message of reality that from conceptually what we wanted to do in 2007 to the reality of what we need to do in 2017, and for those of us who work on that interface, it's a tough message, but one that you can't skirt around. So to start this, I'm going to, I thought about my comments. I remembered a phone call I got at home right after Hurricane Katrina from Melissa Block, and she asked me to do an interview on NPR. And so I was going through the interview and talking about what I had just seen from flying over the coast. And right at the end of the interview, I got this question, was should we rebuild New Orleans? And there was about 5 seconds of pause that before I answered that question, which I'm telling you for the rest of my career, for the last 13 years, has felt like a lifetime. That 5 seconds on the NPR radio was quite dramatic. So now I get 40 minutes to give you my answer, basically, and talk about the Delta and some of the challenges. This is a picture. I want to make sure we're here at the 300th anniversary of New Orleans, and part of the story that I want to tell tonight is that history, to a certain degree, of what we've gone through relative to the challenges of deltas here, of the delta here in North America, but deltas also around the world. I am going to give you a snapshot from the lens of an ecologist. This is a rich history here in New Orleans. If you have never been to New Orleans and don't know much about this region, we have tremendous geographers, Richard Campanella, who is here at Tulane, these books, if you're in town, I highly recommend you pick one up and read through it, because the geography, I'm not going to do the real justice for it while I'm here. Also, there's a new book out on the Gulf. Actually, I just finished this last night, and it's a tremendous story, mainly on Florida, but there's a really in-depth history of Louisiana, as well as the Chaffalay Basin, really nice recent book on the ecology, and one that sort of sets the tone of the talk tonight, Ain't There No More, and another book by historian Carl Brasso and Don Davis. Many of you have this image of Gulf of Mexico and our region, and rightfully so. This is one of the largest catastrophic event of oil introduced into an ecosystem in North America. Following that, I noticed, though, with the coverage of sort of a misunderstanding of our region. And part of my job tonight is to sort of calibrate you on some of the aspects of the system that you're going to be here experiencing over the next week. One is this idea of the Gulf of Mexico being one system, and this is a cover of a diagram that sort of gives you a little bit of the diversity. But then I noticed the National Geographic came out with this image of the ecosystems of the Gulf of Mexico. And what I want to share with you while you're here is that this is our image of where we live. We love mud. This is not, you will not find coral reef ecologists or seagrass ecologists here in coastal Louisiana. It is mud. And it is mud that built this landscape, and it's sediment that in many places would not pass water quality standards. But here we love sediment. We love our wetlands. That mud built one of the largest coastal wetland complexes in North America. We're second to Alaska in wetland area. Some of the most beautiful forested wetlands that you'll see in North America. And we also love our mud bugs. Please do not order crayfish etouffee. It's crawfish, okay? And we love our dark beer, and we love our mud pie. And so I want you to think mud tonight, and mud is who we are. And so now that I have that established, it's mud that builds delta. You think of the shape, the Greek shape, and of course that's the terminology because of the landscape shape of a delta. And that's rightfully so. And certainly it is very unique. If those of you who do work in coastal systems, we work in these prograding landscapes, very different than these transgressive landscapes that probably most of you work in. And the idea is to build land. And it's land that comes from Iowa and comes from other states. We claim it. When it crosses our border, it's ours. But it was built by 41% of the other parts of the United States. But it's transitioning to a transgressive landscape. And this is the nature of the question and the issue that I want to describe to you tonight. And it is a story that's very common to all deltas around the world. And of course, I'll relate to that when I get to the end of my talk and some of the adaptation strategies that we talk about here and their reference to deltas and other parts of the world. So let me start with this slide, because I want you to take the symbol delta, and I want you to think of it differently, and that's the derivative, the rate of change. We use delta also, right, to denote the rate of change. And I want to calibrate you again on the magnitude of some of the numbers that I'm going to show you relative to the rate of change, which is very important because it establishes the challenges that we're dealing with and the magnitude and the scale of the solutions that we're trying to discuss. And one of the first ideas that you see in these images, of course, is the meander by these beautiful maps that were done by Fisk in 1947, the river bends and the river meanders, as well as at the end of the river, the Mississippi River, the avulsions that occur on about a 1,500-year cycle that moves sediment across, and think of it holding a hose, and with about a meter left, turn it on full blast, and that hose whips back and forth, and that essentially sprayed that mud all over our coast that built the wetland area that I showed you earlier. And this is what I'm going to use over and over again, is to take you through this simple mass balance equation. Because it simply is, it's I tell my students, it's money in your checkbook, it's money in your wallet, you know, or a definition of wealth, it's all dependent on inputs and outputs, and it's a balance of elevation that's built relative to the sediment that's delivered and the organic matter from the wetlands that also builds elevation, that compensates for the decrease in elevation that's caused by subsidence and an increase in water levels that's caused by sea level rise. And if that mass balance is off, it distinguishes our landscape of whether it's land or whether it's water. It is quite interesting, if you look in the literature, how many arguments by GIS and people that work in satellite images, the arguments over area of land and area of water. And it's a thin differential as to what describes that, and I want to show you that today. So I've got this little cartoon that establishes, again, the fate of sediment, QSF, or QS, which is the delivery of sediment. FR is a fraction of that sediment that gets deposited, that builds land. And then there's RO, you see up in the equation, which is the organic contribution, and that's relative, and that's countered by, again, subsidence and sea level rise. But the fate of sediment, the river is dumping a large part of that sediment out to the continental shelf. Some of that sediment ends up being deposited in the river channels. This is going to be a big issue when I get to the end, because I'm going to talk about dredging cost, the cost of keeping the mouth of the Mississippi River open as in a lot of depositional environments. Also, we use that sediment in pipeline conveyance for marsh creation. But the key here is this QSF, or QSFR, excuse me, that is triggered by some height of a levee. In the picture I'm showing you at the bottom right, it's the height of a natural levee. Those who work in floodplains know that that water flood level is relative to the stage, and it's a simple switch that turns on that sediment delivery that goes into the floodplain. And that is, and that to the left, that is our elevation. That is what you're standing on right now. The platform that we're on right now was built by that process on the left. And the FR is the fraction of that sediment that actually gets deposited in that floodplain. The QS and the amount of sediment has changed over time, but I want you to remember, when you go down and have your Sazerac tonight, go out to Jackson Square, look at the river, that sediment, that QS is there today. That QS was there 300 years ago. What's different is the FR. That's the story. The story is how much of that are we putting into the floodplain. And the significance of that and this time scale at which it can influence landscape, I want you to get from this, the one place we're building a delta today, and I don't have a pointer, but you see the red dot, that's up in the upper part of the Atchafalaya Basin, where we have an old river control structure, which allows 30% of the combined flow of the Red River and the Mississippi River down the Atchafalaya Basin. And in 1973, started to form this delta. Once it filled in Grand Lake in the Atchafalaya Basin, then it started to form this delta. And you can see the time scale here at which that delta has been built. I'm going to show you in these pictures right here. Here is one of the islands of that landscape that, again, that emerged from 1989, 1998 to 2008, emerged, and what that represents, basically, is it represents a positive of QS times FR plus the organic contribution to elevation that's greater than subsidence and sea level rise. Thus, you see emergence. And those wetlands, and a story I'm going to tell on Thursday, is we can do these successional studies, and it's quite interesting to see ecological processes that change as these ecosystems develop. Now, what that means is, and the point I want to make in this opening this section of my talk, is that the power of the river to form the ecological systems of this landscape. And it's driven, again, by river occupation. Wherever the river is located, land is built, just as I showed you in Wax Lake Delta. But the opposite is true. When the river abandons a location, then the Gulf of Mexico migrates in. And that is the way that this landscape responds and the ecosystems accordingly. In this little cycle here, you notice I use prograding and degrading. In the upper right is a river abandonment, and you see the Gulf of Mexico moving inland. And where I have river occupation on the lower left is, again, when the river occupies a landscape, it forms land and the ecological systems that are associated with it. So the presence and absence of the river drives the ecosystems of this deltaic landscape. Now, counter to that, and again, that is an elevation, right? That is where the outcome of that is building land that's above water. Now, counter to that is subsidence. And subsidence is pretty unique in this area. I'm going to show you rates in a second. And it's essentially is a dewatering of that landscape. See that green alluvium in that geology map of Louisiana? That alluvium is what's compacting, and that's what's causing the subsidence rates. And that is a result of a huge valley being cut out by the river over thousands of years. And that rate is a really nice map that was just recently published by a group here at Tulane, research group by Tornquist. You can see the scale of subsidence rates across this map, and what I want you to notice is the value that bar graph starts at is 6 millimeters a year. That's twice the rate of sea level rise. And it goes up to 12 millimeters a year, which is 4 times the rate of sea level rise. So even if we didn't have sea level rise in our region, our land is sinking, and I'm going to show you in a second with a couple slides. That is the amount that has to be compensated in elevation for there to be land. And if it doesn't, it is water. And the consequences of that is what drives the story and the human settlement story I'm going to get into in a second. And with sea level rise, then you compound the effects of subsidence. And this is out of the master plan. You can't see this very well, but all you have to do is add 3 millimeters a year to the subsidence rate, and you get the rate at which that elevation has to build every year. I've got a little cartoon. Excuse me, let me get water here. I've got a little cartoon to sort of demonstrate this. So let's just start out with a settlement, and what I want to focus on are the parts of this equation, and I want you to focus on water depth. And the reason why water depth is important because it's the drowning of our coastline and our landscape. You know, there is erosion, and we use erosion a lot, but it's drowning. It's going from being above water to below water. And so that water depth becomes very important because as that water depth increases, the feedback is plant production decreases, right? And you get this loss of wetlands. The lighter brown is the marsh soil. That's the elevation that will be built by sediment input or organic matter accumulation. You notice I put QSFR plus the RO. That's the lighter brown. The darker brown is a marsh platform. Now I'm going to take you through a series of these to show you what wetlands have to acclimate to. And the rates, again, we're looking at anywhere from 8 to 14 millimeters a year. Even if there's no sea level rise, with our present rate of subsidence, water depth increases. right? Sea level is still the same, but with subsidence. And so soil has to develop, if you're going to keep the same depth of water, the elevation of the soil from sediment input and root production has to compensate for the subsidence to keep the water depth the same. Now you add to that a rise in sea level. So if you take that soil column that I just built to compensate for subsidence, it's still not enough if I add sea level rise, and all of a sudden water depth gets deeper. Now if I add, so what you see the final is the actual elevation increase that's required in order to keep water depth the same given subsidence and sea level rise. And remember the rates is we're up in that 6 to 14 millimeter a year range. Well, how does that happen? Well, you got to have a hell of a flood. That's how it happened. This is a picture in blue of the crevasses over various floods in the 1800s up to present day, and a picture by Tornquist here at Tulane that again demonstrates this idea of compensation of what I just showed you. That's largely driven by sediment deposition, which gets me to the next phase of my talk, and that's the human settlement. Because the conflict is where flooding is a key process to keeping wetlands sustainable. Flooding also is building elevation of natural levees, and that's exactly where people settled. People settled along the river at higher elevations. So the power of the river to form the ecosystems is also the same power of the river that formed human settlement. In fact, the ARPANT system that I'm showing you here is a system by which land grants were divvied up. You got about 200 meters parallel to the shore and about 600 meters inland from that perpendicular piece of landscape, and that was your land grant. So it gave you the high ground that was right along the edge of the river, and then gave you land for farming crops. This is the distributary system that's in the lower part of the Mississippi River, the historical of how sediment was delivered by floods. Again, a beautiful map by Fisk in 1947. You notice a place like Donaldsonville, I'm going to talk about this quite a bit in the future, Bayou Lafourche. The delta I showed you growing is in the Atchafalaya Bay in the left. But you see this, we're not, many of you work on tributaries. We're distributaries, large streams that get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller to deliver the sediment down into this landscape. I hope you can see this, but this is an 1861 map, 1863, and it shows you the same distributary system, Bayou Lafourche, Donaldsonville, and along these river systems, you can barely see it, are these small little arpents. It's the land grants. And the land grants follow the river. So this coevolution of the river built the patterns of not only where the ecosystems exist, but also where human settlement exists. And that set up conflict, as you see here in the 1927 flood. Now there was flooding, quite a bit of flooding. That was a disturbance before this. But what's so unique about this picture is the presence of Herbert Hoover in the bottom picture on the left. Because this is the flood by which the federal government got involved and built a levee system that became the Flood Control Act of 1928. But this is what built the engineering system that responded to the 1927 flood. So the third lens of understanding the challenges in our region is this control of nature, which is to prevent flooding and prevent the processes that was causing conflict with human settlement along the edge of the river, but also was the process that the ecosystems needed to survive the elevation challenge that I talked about earlier. And here's a picture. The trees you see in the Mississippi River on the right, this is a 2011 flood with New Orleans in the background. Believe me, there are tree trunks. You can't see them. The flood is actually up in the canopy of these trees. Notice the cars driving along and the commerce that's able to occur just as close as it is in proximity to a major flood in 2011. And so this black diagram you see here is project design flood. It's quite fascinating. It's all predicated on the fact that the upper limit of flow going by New Orleans is 1.25 million cubic feet per second. And when the river reaches that stage, then all the flood valves that you see in the upper part of this diagram start turning on. The first is Bonnie Carey. I'm going to show you this in a second, right at the end. And it is the project design flood is what we've been working under since really 1941. The Flood Control Act was 1928, but the final project designs were really implemented in 1941. So basically, this is a landscape and was manipulated by the Corps of Engineers. And what basically, I didn't say it, but if you go back, I think I can do it real quick. Well, I'm not going to worry about it. Is that, you know, pretty obvious, right? That levee converted FR, right, in the equation to what? 0. FR is now 0. QS is still coming by. But now FR is 0 by the formation of levees, because a levee height is built to do what? Not allow flooding. So we took this and said, well, you know, maybe the Corps of Engineers and this project design flood has given us an experimental design. And, you know, and think about it for a second. Donaldsonville, which I showed you several times on the map, where it says Bayou Lafourche disconnect, was in 1904, was when the river was formally disconnected. It had been disconnected a little bit prior to that, but in 1904 that was disconnected. And so the coastal basin you see there identified as Terrebonne, we can identify that as sediment poor, right? The coastal basin right next to it is Atchafalaya, and that's where I showed you the delta actually building. It's sediment rich. Terrebonne, FR equals what? 0. The FR in Atchafalaya is about 20%. As Harry Roberts said, about 20% is the accumulation rate, deposition rate in Atchafalaya. So basically, using the project design flood, we have experimental units, because now we can test the mass balance model that I just showed you, because now we have coastal basins with an FR equal to 0 and coastal basins with an FR is 20%. And I finally get to say this. I've given this talk in front of scientific organizations, but this is the first scientific organization I think will appreciate this comment. These are our Hubbard Brooks. And we sent this up as a proposal to NSF, funded in the Coastal Seas Project. And what you're going to see is some experimental results where we actually look at the response of the landscape relative to this idea that these two basins represent the presence and absence of the river. So again, I've outlined the basins. Terrebonne, you see. Oh, and look, you can see in this is a 2011 satellite, you can see the presence of the sediment plume in the Atchafalaya basin that is on the left. And right next to it is the Terrebonne, and you see the absence of the plume. This is a 2011 flood. You see the absence of the plume in Barataria. You see the presence of the plume at the mouth of the river, and actually you can see the plume going into Lake Pontchartrain from Bonnie Carey. But what you're seeing here in white line is a 1932 shoreline using marsh-to-water ratios of 50%, superimposed on this satellite image of 2011. Now, if, given the equation I showed you, mass balance, what do you expect is going to happen, right? Is over time, that shoreline, will it stay in its location, right, with the presence of the river, and will it migrate and move in the absence? And in 2010, in the green line, you see the outcome. In the Atchafalaya, with the presence of the river, the shoreline has not moved since 1932. In the coastal basin, both the coastal basin in Terrebonne and in Barataria, very surprisingly, each of them moved 18 kilometers from 1932 to 2010. At some point, 200 meters a year. That is the migration rate at which the Gulf of Mexico is moving inland. Now, we took this one step farther. Okay, so we have a change in landscape. What about flooding risk? And what about the presence of flood? this is a picture, and think about this for a second, because now what I've done is I've transferred this talk from river flooding to what? Coastal flooding. There's a member of the Mississippi River Commission, lives in Houma. He told me that his grandfather's house, they always worried about backwater flooding. And son of a gun, he said a hurricane came along and wiped it out with frontwater flooding. So we've transitioned our flooding discussion from river flooding to hurricanes. And there's a beautiful model called ADCIRC. It builds these little grids, and at each point is a node, and that node figures out the physics and can tell you water velocity, but more importantly, water elevation during a hurricane event. So we took this grid, and you can actually manipulate these grids to replicate landscapes. And what I'm showing you here in the gray is this density of grids that we use to build the levee system around New Orleans. And what you see in the color is the Hurricane Katrina run with a stable hurricane system that was rebuilt after Hurricane Katrina. This picture on the lower right includes the $1.2 billion that was spent on the hurricane protection system after Katrina. And what the colors show you is where flooding occurs and where it doesn't occur. So I want to before I show you the next slide, what we're doing basically then is what? We're taking those 1932 landscapes and those 2010 landscapes, build an ADCIRC mesh, taking into account where the shoreline is located, and then run hurricanes over it to see if, in fact, with the migration of that shoreline, do we see a change in flooding from hurricanes. So the next slide is to set this up. You see the coastal basins, the Atchafalaya, the Terrebonne, and Barataria. From 1930 to 1970, we're using inundation time. You can see a little bit of an increase in Terrebonne, hardly any increase in the Vermilion. Again, these are with the migration from 1930 to 1970 of the shoreline that I showed you earlier. Now, the one that's going to be very important is the one I'm going to show you next, because it's going to have the 1930 to 2010 shoreline. In the Atchafalaya, you see very little change in inundation time, but in both Terrebonne and Barataria, by the density of color, you see the presence of increase in flooding. If I plot this on a graph, the blue dots are the differences from 1930 to 2010 of flooding in the Atchafalaya, where the shoreline did not move. And in the other graphs, you see the increase in inundation time in both Barataria and Terrebonne associated with the migration of the Gulf of Mexico closer to these communities. So with this, we've been able to document this change. Well, what about the human perception of risk? Here's the Ile de Jean Charles. You may have heard of this community, the first official community of climate refugees. They're located in Terrebonne, which is a parish that I just showed you we've been doing experimental work on. There's a picture in the upper right where it's located. There's the isopleths that migrated over that community from 1932 to 1970, or 2010. So this community actually watched the shoreline migrate right through its community in the last, from 1930 to 2010. In fact, you'll see also, I will put a little dot in there. The blue dot is LUMCON, our marine consortium. It's also located where the shoreline has migrated right past it, with the cutoff on the river. Well, what's the human significance of this? HUD funded $93 million to the state of Louisiana, and $40 million of which approximately is being used to migrate this whole community inland. So we're actually making a connection now of river engineering, landscape change, flooding risk, human migration. The human settlement that moved out down the river because it was high ground is now reversing and moving inland. Let me make one other point with this. I don't like the title in this. These are climate refugees, but what you have to remember is that the migration of the landscape is by river management. It's the engineering of the river. Climate change does what? It amplifies our land use change. And it's a very important point because we control how we manage the river. And we can have an influence over instances like this by way of decisions we make related to river management. Now, this whole significance of coastal flooding is not just Katrina. I want to take you one hurricane back here in New Orleans, and that's Betsy. And the significance of which is the hurricane protection system was actually funded by Congress after this 1965 event. That's why we were able to rebuild Katrina so quick, because we had congressional authorization already in place. You had to just write the check. And that's how we got $1.2 billion in a new system after Katrina. But it started after Hurricane Betsy. And what you'll also notice, and it's going to be part of the ending of my story, is that is when the National Flood Insurance Program was actually initiated. Was actually in response to the hurricane here in New Orleans. So not only the Flood Control Act of 1928, but the National Flood Insurance Program of 1968, both of which are products of disturbances, extreme events that happen in this city. So what the story, and the point I want to make, and I could have used one of Holling's diagram that many of you may be familiar with, but I'll just describe it. And that is, you have a major disturbance, and right after it is the reorganization. And that reorganization is quick, it's swift, money like you've never seen before, there's shovel-ready projects, and that's what's going to happen, and that influences the long-term landscape changes we have to live with for decades after. And if you don't capture it right here, and that's pretty obvious. So just to give you the significance of this, to scale it, Project Design Flood has now increased our vulnerability to coastal flooding from hurricanes by landscape migration. Here's a number that was in the 2007 master plan, $7 to $23 billion per year annually in damages that are associated with storms, associated with the landscape issues that we're dealing with. Thus, what is our focus of our restoration project? Build land, reduce risk. It gets right back to what? The engineering phenomena that we talked about back in 1927. And here it's a pretty comprehensive plan, has $50 billion worth of projects. Representative Leger was just talking about. $25 billion are associated with protection, $25 billion with restoration. Of that restoration, the largest part is in marsh creation. And a large part of our plan is to reconnect the river using diversions back to the floodplain. In other words, do what? Convert FR from zero back to some value, right? And so you can see the cycle that I'm developing here. So let's change gears here with the time I have left. Because now I want to talk about this concept of design. And I want us to go back a little bit historically and try to figure out how exactly did we get where we are. And think of it from an adaptive management point of view. Is this just unintended consequences? We didn't know what was going to happen when we built those levees, right? Or if they were alternative designs, what does adaptive management do? This is a point after every one of these disturbances that you think about that design and you modify them, and that's truly what adaptive management is all about. So let's take this historical account, and there's some great books, that, again, I don't mind professing here. Barry's book on Rising Tide, great book on the Atchafalaya called Beyond Control. This is about the Mississippi jumping tracks and coming down the Atchafalaya. Designing the bayous, thick, but I mean this, if you really want to understand the logic and the thinking that went through the designs of these major river engineering, and of course John McPhee's book, The Control of Nature. But I want to share with you some thoughts of what people were thinking when they were designing back in the 1800s of what this river would look like. And the one that I'd spend a lot of time doing this because when I think about us talking to alternatives that we can try to get the public to think about and political and the people that are in the position of power, then, show the historical thoughts into these different design features. And the one that I have gotten quite a bit of inspiration is reading the books by Charles Elliott. Charles Elliott did a book. If you read the first paragraph in this book in 1852, you'd think it was written after Hurricane Katrina. It's all about the fact that if we don't put multiple outlets and spillways in the Mississippi River, the Gulf of Mexico will migrate inland, 1852. You can see he professed building outlets and spillways to shunt floodwaters from the river. He actually has 3 locations where he defended the locations of diversions, one of which is Old River Control Structure, Donaldsonville. Just think if we'd built a diversion and kept Donaldsonville open in Bayou Lafourche, you wouldn't have seen that migration in Terrebonne, and a outlet over east of New Orleans. 1897 is a beautiful article in the National Geographic, which actually talks about the fact that with subsidence, if you do a levee-only design, you're going to have the migration to the Gulf of Mexico, and you're going to benefit the next 2 or 3 generations. But after that, there's going to be all hell to pay, basically. And we are at that 4th generation today. So we knew, and what's interesting about this article in the National Geographic is it does not mention sea level rise, but it does clearly mention subsidence, and the fact that if you cut off the sediment with subsidence, you will see the Gulf of Mexico migrate inland. And then this is the one that I really is pretty close to me, because it talks about the conservation policy that should be restoration of natural conditions and the fact of the consequences of a levee-only system related to how the Mississippi River and the Delta works. It was published in 1928 in the Ecological Society of America. It was actually published 90 years ago in Ecology, and it was published by a Tulane graduate, Percy Viasca, who actually became one of a lot of us, our hero of naturalists, went on to serve in the wildlife and fisheries and a stellar career. But when you go back and read that article in Ecology, he nails it. And he nails it exactly what was happening when the discussion was going on related to the levee system. I found this cartoon. It's great. I got Hoover giving the old Mississippi the levee-only prescription. You'll notice on the desk are all the other little ideas of design. You don't see the spillway. But I think this captures it best. To give you some little historical significance, the fellow standing there in the Corps of Engineers was the director of the Corps of Engineers in 1928, Colonel Jadwin, Jadwin, and his chief engineer's report was the architect of the design in 1928, modified heavily, though, relative to what ended up being built in 1941. So why? We knew this. It was unintended consequences. It was the fact that, there was clear direction as to the consequences and the design criteria that were going to be developed and the outcomes relative to what was going on. So let me share, and this is, those of you from the Colorado or other regions, you know the answer to this really well, and I'm going to start with navigation. And it is the economic interest. If you look on the return on investment on 1928 public works project that Congress funded, it's probably one of the highest of any public work project Congress has ever funded. Our navigation system here in our ports is very unique. This is the only place in the United States where you have a river system that connects with cities all the way up to Chicago with very efficient transportation of commerce on the river, together with the intracoastal waterway that runs east-west. So you have this north-south corridor that can touch the interior of the United States. You have the east-west waterway, which is the intracoastal waterway. You have the railroad system, all 5 classes of railroads in New Orleans. That's very few cities that have that. And we have the interstate system. So this internodal connection of commerce in New Orleans is like no other place in the United States. And its economic interest is huge. So you may not see it while you're here in New Orleans. If you do go up on some of the restaurants or bars and some of the high-rise hotels, take a look out and see if you can see elements of the port. You'll see it moving. You'll see the cargo moving up and down the river. You may even get in a location where you're looking up to see a ship actually go by. But this is New Orleans, and it has a tremendous reach across the nation or across the world. Oil and gas. We're now 30% of the domestic energy supply. A lot of people don't realize this. At Port Fourchon, most of the energy that comes into the United States from foreign imports is processed at a pumping station right off the coast from Port Fourchon. And the infrastructure and the economic interest of this is huge. And then we have a fishery. We have the second largest fishery in the United States. But not only is it a fishery by tonnage and by productivity, but it's also a fishery of culture. You have all the different cultures that have migrated into this region and build their lifestyle. So how, given the fact that we had designs, we had clearly designs that could match what the consequences were going to be, we have these economic interests, so what do you do now? I mean, what happens now with the situation that we're in, and how do you think and how do you walk through the challenges? And this is something that is why I bring up this idea of ecosystem design. Nice little paper. If you have not seen it, when this paper came out by Ross, it has the exact same process that I've gone through in my career since Katrina. Peter Calthorpe, a very renowned planner, probably one of the few people I've ever worked with who was on the front page of Time magazine. Peter Calthorpe came in after Katrina, and we did and the state invested a huge amount of money in a regional plan. And Peter said, you know, Robert, this is the first project I've ever worked on where the landscape isn't stable. I don't know where things are going to be 25 years from now. And so it is developing ecosystem and applying ecosystem ecology and the processes that we want to work on, but do it in the concert of all the drivers that you're dealing with, the economic drivers, the drivers of planning, public safety, infrastructure, highways, where do you put hospitals, where do you put schools, as well as thinking of where and how do you develop ecosystems. It's adding the green in this diagram, but you're doing it and still keeping the other boxes that you see on the right, because the economic interests are there and you have to deal with it. So real quickly, ecosystems, economics, and community. Before I start this, one of the other powerful things, we built a sustainability studio at LSU after this experience of doing this Louisiana Builds, which is a regional plan with ecosystems and where we did restoration. And you know, in that studio, we work with designers, and designers are just fantastic of how to tell your story. So we would sit with the engineers and come up with these ideas of what we want to present, and then the designers would give it a presence. And so what you're going to see is just an example of what we would use to get the people and the clients and the political staff to buy into some of our ideas using some of the essence of graphics. So the story is empower the river, build and sustain wetlands, strengthen living culture, secure economic indispensability, but also integrate investments. So what is ecosystem design? It's trying to take your knowledge of ecosystem ecology and fit it in with the constraints of what I just demonstrated. It's trying to change paradigms of how to manage the river so that it has multiple outlets, so you can get back some of the deltaic processes to build the ecosystem, but also keep the economic interests of the river. It's transforming an existing project design flood. You have to work within the mandated design feature that is not going to go away. And so the whole idea was we're going to need future flooding enhancements because of climate change. We don't know what's coming down the river in the future. So to keep New Orleans viable, we need to think about how we're going to develop our flooding system and our project design flood in the future. And while we're doing that, let's have shovel-ready projects for ecosystem ecology. It's generations. This is not something you're trying to change the trajectory. Remember, it's 3 generations in National Geographic. It's 3 generations we're trying to influence. It's not the people that are in power today or politicians. It's designing the outlay of what the economic and the communities and infrastructure will look like and fitting deltaic processes within that construct. It's taking a fragmented view of where we put things in a landscape and trying to integrate with the flood processes of these structures relative to where we put communities and people. And so if you go through this generation real quick, it's connect flood control to ecosystem building processes, and it's all about constraining and reducing the footprint of the delta because we don't have enough processes to keep the wetlands that we have present with sea level rise and subsidence. So how can we align communities and people with the processes of ecosystems so that we have a more coherent landscape? And that's what these diagrams are trying to demonstrate. It's very similar, it's very interesting, this paper by Tesler, that you can't see this, but I'll just tell you what they did was they took different deltas and ranked them based on their vulnerability just on the physical dimensions of the system. And then they actually looked at the capacity to do adaptation and re-ranked the deltas. And so I think that's a really important process. You know, it's not just what is our rates of subsidence and sea level rise, what's our capacity to adapt to the new thinking relative to how we build ecosystems in a delta under a flood control system. So my final slides is, well, is there any, what are the issues? What's the big thoughts related to trying to accomplish this? The positive side is I want you to appreciate the Bonnie Carey Spillway, which is one of many that we have. Oh, the lights just went out. Relative to the fact that we've learned and we have the capacity to manage the river to move major processes that are responsible for delta building. And you see the river, you see New Orleans, actually you landed, there's the airport where you landed. That blue dot is where we are right now. The Bonnie Carey is actually open. You can see in that red arrow, the river with the Bonnie Carey open, the flood control structure, that's about 250,000 cubic feet per second moving in the Lake Pontchartrain, and you see the plume. There's the Bonnie Carey that's open during the 2011 flood, and look at that sand. It's huge. I mean, the capacity of the river to deliver deposition is there. It's getting features that we've learned how to build, we know how to operate. They're flood control structures that can be huge. John Day has these beautiful studies showing wetland accretion in these outfall areas and bottomland hardwood forest, the productivity of the forest actually respond to when the Bonnie Carey is open. Really, the downside is, here's a cost that I showed you earlier under different scenarios of sea level rise and frequency of storms, and you see this number up to 23 billion annually. We really don't know. I mean, I don't know what these numbers, but I'm going to tell you that that's the number that's going to get people to rethink paradigms of how we manage the river. And so the challenge is to use a number like that and have shovel-ready projects and designs on the table to where the flood control system can be manipulated to provide for ecosystems border or boundary around the infrastructure that we're building. That is a huge deal. And associated with that is insurability. And just this week, Bill Cassidy announced that he had been working with the Senate to push through an extension of the National Flood Insurance Program. My question is, the outcome of what we do relative to changing these paradigms, who pays? And what is the cost? What's the insurability? How do you monetize the risk? And who pays? And let me tell you, that is going to drive just like it did in the 1850s, just like it did following the 1927 flood. That's what drove the designs then, and it will drive the designs in the future. Are we ready to put things on the table with the connection of deltaic processes that can build ecosystems around? My final one is the dredging. The dredging costs with sea level rise at the mouth of major rivers, it's gone up. Here we have the largest dredging budget for the Corps of Engineers here in New Orleans than any other. In fact, I've even heard, if you add up, Mark, you can tell me whether this is true or not, if you add up all the budgets of dredging for all the other Corps districts, it doesn't match the dredging costs we spend here in the lower Mississippi River. So so moving the port or changing the way we manage the lower river with some of the ideas of sediment use to build ecosystems, this is going to be a major player, these dredging costs. And with sea level rise, it's a big deal. And finally, what's very interesting is that I looked at where deltas are located in hurricanes. Remember, everything I showed you to a large degree is related to how frequently we're hit from coastal storms related to the land that we lose. And there's two areas. Here in the Mississippi is our delta, which is located in a hurricane, a high frequency of hurricane events. Same as in Asia, they also, major deltas are located in hurricane events. The other major deltas don't have hurricanes around them, but these two regions do. And that's going to play out to be a big deal because your cost factor of doing something is associated, insurability is associated with what happens with those storms in the future and how people respond. I want to plug this. NSF is having 26th to 28th a series of workshops on communities and people, coastlines and people. If you're interested, please sign up. You log in. You have to be available those 3 days to participate. I highly recommend it. I want to thank sponsors such as the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics, which I was a co-PI on for years, and Frontiers. NSF is funding a lot of effort down here. And I also want to share with you, you're here in a region that wrote the textbook by the scientists who wrote the textbook on deltas, the Coastal Studies Institute, by these esteemed players here that understand delta dynamics, the ecologists that we have a very strong relationship between geomorphology and ecology, and then at LUMCON, the group that I've worked with, Don and Denise and Daryl, through the years, understanding the connections and understanding the processes and challenges that we're living with. And so I'll take any questions. Thank you. And the lights are out. I can't see you, but if you identify yourself when you come up, if there's any questions. I can't see out there. Any questions? Everybody wants to go to Bourbon Street? Yeah.
I'm very curious about one thing, Bob. You talked about Louisiana and the coast right here. Is everything upstream in the Mississippi irrelevant to what goes on down here?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I had some slides because certainly every major delta is connected to an upper watershed, and we certainly have two major issues. One are the nutrients from the farmland and the nitrate that comes down. And just this week, Nancy Rabelais and Gene Turner announced the size of the hypoxia is less than what they normally see, but it's still much larger than the national objective to reduce the hypoxic area. And that's a major issue, one of the largest hypoxic zones in the world off our coast. And second is the sediment concentration, the sediment load. It used to be about 400 metric tons, million metric tons that would come down the river. Now it's about 200, and there's 400 dams and development of reservoirs. But I've heard people like Harry Roberts say, well, even though your QS has dropped by half, if you can increase your FR, which is the percent that gets deposited, you can compensate for that. So move the outlets up farther upriver to get higher deposition percentages. Right now it's about 20% deposition is what we trap. So suppose you could get 30%, or could you get 40% and compensate for the lower sediment? I tell you, you work at Wax Lake like I have for 8 years, the power of the river to build land when it's there is still is impressive. It's 1 to 2 square kilometers per year of land that's built in that location. But those are the two major, it's the nitrate and the sediment concentration. Yeah, good question.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I just have a sort of a political question. Adjusting the engineering so the outflows are sort of more consistent and working to build land. Is there an issue? What is the extent of the issue with having to resettle people that are living in those areas, or moving economic centers? Or I'm from Canada, so I don't really know what the population densities are around the river. So.
Well, there's about 1 million people south of I-10. Okay, give you a number there, and about 450,000 now is the population of New Orleans. It used to be 650,000. It's a major issue of people making that decision and not buyouts and government making that decision. And that's really important here. But what you have to set up is a system of how they make that decision. If you get flood insurance that taxpayers pay for, then what's your incentives, right, of where you build and what you're not monetizing the cost. What's the responsibility of the banks that loan the money? Could that actually influence, decisions of where you build and where you live? And then, I heard an economist once that took the cost of a diversion and actually said, what if you put this money in a trust fund and added up all the real estate value and said, okay, if there was a trust fund, I wanted to move inland, and I decided to do that, can I get some help in relocating out of that trust fund? And it was, and the amount to cover all the real estate south of I-10 was equal to one big diversion. and so it's a really interesting number. And then the opposite of that is to tax people and build a wall. And that's what's happening in Morganza to the Gulf. The levy district can raise money by taxing and build levees, and that protects people so that they don't have to move inland. So I don't know if that helps or not, but it is certainly a lot of discussion. And then finally, you have to, we have money now invested in the master plan for non-structural adaptation. So you raise your house. So you raise above base flood elevation, and that's the way that you reduce repetitive losses. And then we're having monies and programs that can help people elevate relative to the increased flooding risk. Good question. These are, and the thing is these are not questions. Some communities will deal with this, coastal communities, 25 years from now. Remember, it's 40 years in some locations before sea level rise matches our subsidence rate. I mean, our communities are dealing with this right now. These are discussions that our state is in, and it puts us right at the forefront of these discussions and how to mitigate and how to adapt.
I'd like to follow that question up, if I might.
I hear a voice.
So the scale at which you've been operating is extraordinarily large, and I'm curious as to your thoughts about scaling down to the human dimension and the individual human and community dimension. In terms of some of these problems obviously have differential effects on different communities, and in particular, poor communities, people of low socioeconomic status are hardest hit, have the least resilience and least resistance. And so I'm wondering how these kinds of issues get addressed in terms of taking into account these historical inequities and historical differences in the abilities of these different communities to address these issues. I mean, clearly, providing support based on the real estate value isn't going to allow poor people to move as readily as richer people to move further inland. So your thoughts would be really appreciated.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And my first response is, since I've gotten out of my own little systems ecology box and have gotten so involved in all these discussions with planners and sociologists and architects and engineers, my first response to your question is awareness. It comes up every discussion, every meeting, that issue comes up. It's at the forefront. It's about every plan or every strategy of adaptation. That issue is on the table. People like Shirley Alaska make sure that issue is on the table. And it certainly is something that even I think the Ile de Jean Charles community is a really good example of that, their ability to migrate relative to the economics and the help that they're getting. But I don't know if we have all the answers. I think having these programs, but again, it gets back into who pays. who pays? You know, is it the industry? If that's the workforce, should they pay? Or does the insurance, does the reinsurance agencies pay? Does the banks, do they pay? So that is still very complicated, but the awareness that this has to be dealt with is there in every discussion that I've been involved with.
Thank you for a very fascinating presentation. I had a question. I was struck by the irony of the need to dredge certain areas, and so I'm just curious, where is that material being deposited, and is that helping with the problem of not having enough sediment in certain areas?
So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the maintenance harbor trust fund. I wasn't until about right after Katrina. It's a trust fund that the dredging communities, that the industry pays into, and as it's spent down to move sediment, that more money gets put in. And we're unable to use, in many cases, that trust fund to move sediment and build wetlands, to build ecosystems. So for years we've been trying to modify that, and I don't think it's been modified, Mark, yet. I mean, I don't know where that stands, but you know, we have tons of sediment. Why can't we get beneficial use out of it? And what we end up doing is it's being moved from the areas of deposition and just gets dredged up, and it stays in the river. It gets moved to a different location in the river so it can get out on the continental shelf or get out of the river past these areas of deposition. So that's one of the most, and it's frustrating when you talk to industry. They get frustrated by it. And again, you know, that is a process that we have with huge resource available, and we don't have the mechanism, and the money is there, and we don't have the mechanism of the bureaucratic mechanism to move that sediment and build wetlands. And we do have examples of DuPont, is very successful long-distance pipeline conveyance, Lake Hermitage, and that has demonstrated that it can be done. But the cost of doing that, right, versus having a diversion where the gravity of the river, and let me make sure we're clear, the way these diversions work and the way all these flood control structures work is they're gates that you open when the river stage gets to a certain point, and by gravity, there's no pumping, right? There's no fossil fuel. The water flows through those gates, and that's the sand that I showed you in that picture. That's all delivered by gravity. So what you pay for is the upfront cost of the structure. You have to pay for every time you open it. It's pretty costly because of the train and all the work that goes into opening those gates. But, you know, that's one of our big frustrations. I hope I addressed your question, but it is a huge frustration to have all this sediment and this dredging capacity in our region, and it's not being used more for our deltaic stability. Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. I knew I'd think of it in a second. Oh, okay.
Going to have to stop the questions now, but let's thank Robert Twilley again for an excellent talk. And please join us, please join Robert, and we'll all be on the other side of this wall, right behind you, so you exit those doors and go in behind. There's a opening plenary reception. I wanted to give special thanks to the section. There are section and chapter chairs, and some of groups are indicated there for the mentor-mentee building relationship exercise that we're doing tonight. So thank you again, and head us over to the reception.